that you want to buy the book, which we hope you do. And with that, I would like to, one other thing I should mention is that tonight's program is also being sponsored by the 250 Plus initiative with Professor Alger, and we are very, very proud to be partnering with his initiative tonight. So with that, let me just turn it over to Professor Sui. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. Okay. Okay. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Excellent. Yeah, sit in the front. So thank you so much for coming tonight, and thank you, Tom, for that introduction. It's really an honor to be speaking here and be sponsored by CCPS and the 250 Plus initiative at American University. So I'm Liz Suhay. I'm a professor of government in the School of Public Affairs, and I'm just going to briefly introduce our panelists here tonight, and then we are going to roll into the program. I'm going to give a 10-minute overview of my book, and then we're going to give about a half hour to what I think is going to be a really rich and productive conversation with the panelists, and then we'll have time for questions from the audience. Okay, so let me introduce first Jane Hall. So Jane Hall is my colleague here at American University. She's associate professor in the School of Communication, and among other things, she is the author of Politics and the Media, Intersections and New Directions. We also have Bradley Hardy here with us this evening. So he is Distinguished Professor in the McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown University. So Bradley's also a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, and he has authored, co-authored a lot of different scholarly articles, very relevant to what we'll be talking about tonight, including the article Stalled Progress, 5 Decades of Black, White, and Rural-Urban Income Gaps. And so we also have Hans Knoll with us tonight. So Hans is Associate Professor of Government at Georgetown University and the co-director of the Georgetown Democracy Initiative, somewhat important initiative in these times, unfortunately. And he is the author or co-author of several books, including Political Ideologies and Political Parties in America and the Party Decides, Presidential Nominations Before and After Reform. All right, so I'm going to get going by talking a little bit, as I said, about the book to kind of set the scene here, and then we'll move into some panelist discussion. Thank you. I'm Liz and not Tom. All right. So, the book, similarly titled as the event tonight, Debating the American Dream, How Explanations for Inequality Polarize Politics. So this is a book that focuses on partisan perspectives on economic inequality, and I think has a lot to say about this moment we're in, and maybe have been in for a while, arguably, which is a place of tremendous disagreement over what our economic policy should look like, and when we're making policy at all, it's swinging back and forth, and when we're not making policy, well, we're just sort of standing still. So the backdrop of the book is really a concern about inequality. So inequality in the US is really stark. We've been becoming more and more unequal for several decades now. And so, these statistics, many of you will be familiar with these statistics. We have the top 10% that earns close to 50% of the income pie in the United States, while the bottom 50% earns only 10% of income. Wealth is even starker. That inequality is even starker. We have the top 10% holding 2/3 of the wealth in the nation, and the bottom 50% has almost no wealth at all. Okay, so if we want to make this a little bit more concrete, we can talk about our favorite billionaires. So we have Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg. They had a great year in 2025. Their companies earned so much that they made the equivalent of $100 million a day. And we have Elon Musk, who is the richest man in the world. he made the equivalent in 2025 of $600 million a day. And then at the other end of the scale, 2 in 1,000 Americans is homeless, and 1/3 are sleeping outside. So we have some stark differences here, and I might note that if Elon Musk were to put aside just a few weeks of his salary, he could actually end homelessness in the United States completely. Okay, so some people argue that the American dream actually is still alive and well. And I want to stand here and entertain this for a moment and say the American dream could still be true, even given that inequality, right? So how could that be? The American dream says you ought to be successful if you work hard. It doesn't say that everybody's guaranteed success, right? And so the argument on the other side would be, oh, and I'm sorry, I'm having some slide difficulties here. Here we go. So the argument on the other side would be, well, people deserve what they get, right? And the rich are working awfully hard. And I don't doubt that the three guys that we looked at on the previous slide work every day, work very hard. So the rich are working awfully hard. The poor work much less. And as for the homeless, maybe they refuse to work at all. All right, so we have a partisan divide, I argue, in the book over the reality of the American dream. And I want to be clear, before I talk about the divide, that people uniformly think that the American dream and the ideal is great. We like the idea of people being rewarded for success. But where we have debate is not over the ideal, it's over the reality. So we have a divide according to political party with respect to whether the nation actually delivers the American dream, whether it actually rewards success, and we would also say punishes people if they are not working hard, living up to their potential. One way I look at this in the book is by looking at partisan rhetoric among party leaders. And we can look at speeches, we can look at different kinds of rhetoric out there. But what I do that I think is more systematic is, with the help of a research assistant, Mark Tenenbaum, who may be watching, spent many, many hours on this, comb through decades of party platforms and look to see whether there are patterns in how the different parties, how the two parties talk about the American dream, about economic inequality, about why some people get ahead and why some people fall behind. And when you do that, you see a pretty consistent pattern that Republicans are much more likely to be American dream believers. They're optimistic about the American dream, about the nation's ability to provide the dream. In fact, that it is rewarding those who are working hard, who deserve it. So you see things like on the left here, from the Republican Party platform in 2008, America's free economy creates opportunity, rewards self-reliance and hard work, and unleashes productive energies. Oftentimes, Republicans speak in a kind of positive, optimistic way. If they are talking about poverty or economic struggles, they're more likely to locate responsibility within individuals or within families or communities. And so an example is a frequent return to the notion of marriage and how marriage is an important antidote to child poverty. If we go over to the Democratic side, we see a very different pattern. And now this has become especially apparent in the past couple of decades. So Democrats within those party platforms, and this may not be surprising to you, we have lots of different Democratic leaders out there saying these kinds of things, but they have this skeptical take. So example from 2012, for too long we've had a financial system that stacked the deck against ordinary Americans. That behavior not only destroyed the financial system, it cost our economy millions of jobs. More recently, the party has focused quite a bit on racial inequality. So from the 2020 platform, the Democratic Party says there's a persistent, pernicious racial wealth gap that holds millions of Americans back. So these are just little snippets, right? There's a lot of this throughout the party platforms. So this is one thing that I look at in the book. I also focus on public opinion. So this so far is the rhetoric among leaders. That doesn't necessarily mean that the public follows suit. But when you look at the public opinion data, you find that the public mirrors back this rhetoric that the leaders are sharing with the public. So I've got a few slides here with public opinion data. I've reduced several chapters down into 3 slides. We'll see how this goes. So the first thing I want to show you is that Republicans are more optimistic than Democrats that hard work leads to success. So again, this is the American public. And these data go back to 1999, and they go through the Biden administration. The top line there, the top line are Republicans. The bottom line are Democrats. These aren't colored as they should be because in the world of academic publishing, you don't get the full color range, by the way. So apologies if that's a little confusing. But in any case, we see here clearly that on the top, we have Republicans who are much more likely to say that hard work leads to success, close to 80%, falling somewhat over time, not surprisingly, right, but very optimistic. And that bottom line, those are the Democrats. And the Democrats actually begin over on the left, actually fairly optimistic that hard work leads to success. So that's close, about 75% of Democrats say that. But then they really fall dramatically over time, so that by 2022, only about 40% of Democrats say that hard work leads to success. So you can see we have this big gap opening up between the parties. Okay, so we can also look at beliefs about the causes of racial inequality. So this is something that has been discussed quite a bit recently, but we also have data going back for decades on this. So I'm going to show you data on Democrats being more convinced than Republicans that racial inequality is due to education inequity, so due to structural barriers to success. Okay, so here we've got it flipped. We have the Democrats on the top now. So the Democrats are more likely to say that education inequity is driving racial inequality, and Republicans on the bottom are much less likely to say that. What's interesting about this is that actually if you go all the way back to the beginning of the series, I don't know if you can see the number there, it goes all the way back to 1977, there wasn't a big difference between the parties. And it's opened up over time. And then if you get to the end here, right, a really enormous difference between the two parties with respect to what they think the causes are of racial inequality. Okay, so the last thing that I want to show you is how all of this connects up with policy. So it's one thing to say that our partisan tribes differ over the causes of inequality and the American dream. It's another to say that all of this has anything to do with people's policy preferences, how they vote, etc. And so what I want to do is I want to demonstrate that yes, these beliefs are closely intertwined with policy preferences in a meaningful way. And it's most meaningful if we can actually do this by holding partisanship constant, by looking within the parties. We already know partisanship is related to these beliefs, but if we look within the party coalitions, do we also see a relationship between these beliefs about inequality and policy views? And the answer is yes, we do. So here, on the left panel, those are Democrats. In the middle are people who call themselves independents. And on the right are people who are Republicans. On the bottom is what people think about inequality. And I'm going to have to move a little bit here. I think that'll be easiest. So on the right-hand side here of each of these, on the right-hand side are people who think that there's quite a bit of structural inequality out there. They're very skeptical of the American dream. So people on the right-hand side, skeptical of the American dream. On the y-axis here, going up, we have people who are economically progressive, and down here, economically conservative. And we have two different kinds of questions we're looking at: people's support for government social welfare, and whether people think we should decrease economic inequality, for example, by raising taxes on the rich. You can see among Democrats only, there's a modest upward slope as people become more skeptical that the American dream is real. They become somewhat more economically progressive, but frankly, all Democrats are pretty economically progressive. What's interesting is when you move to independents and Republicans. So there's a lot of heterogeneity among independents in particular and what they think about the causes of inequality in the American dream. And you get these huge differences in policy views between independents who are more concerned about the reality of the American dream, more skeptical, and independents who are more likely to say everything is all is well. So they're more likely to be conservative. And you even get that among Republicans, right? And we think a little bit about the Trump coalition and the really hardcore Trump supporters here. Many of them actually are more skeptical about the American dream being alive and well. So they're more likely to have these views about the American dream here, and they are also more likely to be economically progressive. So more likely to say we should tax the rich, more likely to say we should have a generous social welfare state. Now, they still probably are voting for Trump, right? But they have those policy views. Okay, so that's the data for you. And I want to talk a little bit before I wrap things up about why we have this debate in the first place. So I've shown that there are these big gaps between the parties. I've shown that it's wrapped up with their policy views. But, why is it that we have these differences in the first place? Why doesn't everybody just agree, right? Why don't we have essentially one mega party with heterogeneity within it? And so here I draw on some political science research. And we actually have somebody here tonight, Hans Knoll, who's written quite a bit about this. So I'm drawing from what's called the UCLA School of Political Science and Political Parties. And the idea here is that our parties are coalitions of policy demanders. And the parties create agendas that reflect what those demanders want. On the Democratic side, the Democratic Party has long been the party of lower income people and groups. It may not be today, but it has that history. And so it tends to have an agenda that's focused on redistribution. On the Republican side, it has long been a party that's more associated with wealthy individuals and big businesses. So they've tended to be more interested in maintaining the economic status quo or even increasing inequality, which sounds strange to say, but if you're trying to reduce, for example, the generosity of the social welfare state, that's essentially saying you're trying to increase inequality. So we have these policy demanders, we have these agendas, and then we need these arguments to justify those agendas. We need to explain why it is we're doing this, right? And the best way to justify redistribution for Democrats is to say, all of this is terribly unfair. We don't have a meritocracy. The American dream isn't real. And on the Republican side, the best way to defend the status quo, or even say maybe inequality could be even greater, is to say we do have a meritocracy. The American dream is real. The people who are falling behind, it's no fault but their own, right? And so we get these bundles of agendas and justifications that then fall along party lines. Now, I do a little bit in the book, and we're going to talk more about this tonight. I'm very interested in what the panelists have to say. The ground truth at the moment is probably closer to the Democratic narrative, in my humble opinion. I'm not the economist in the room, but I think many academics would agree with that. But it's also important to point out that both parties are engaged in trying to persuade. And so both parties inevitably exaggerate some and cherry pick the facts. And so that's important to acknowledge. So the last thing that I want to say is that we're in this moment with Donald Trump, who ran as a populist, especially if we go back to his first run for the presidency. So, how does this make any sense? the Republican Party base has become much more working class. Trump, when he first came out of the gate, I would argue spoke like a Democrat because he knew many of the people in his base wanted to hear that. And frankly, he attracted a lot of independents as well. But the donors, and this has become even truer in recent years, the donors to the Republican Party continue to be quite wealthy. And so they rein in, they kind of hold back Republicans from pursuing more economically egalitarian policy. That's what I would argue. And so the Republican Party at the moment is kind of stuck in this more traditionally economically conservative rut. That said, I also want to acknowledge that there is real change afoot. And so there are some real egalitarian efforts underway on the Republican side. And I think we're going to have a lot of discussion about this, so I won't say too much about this, but I will give a shout out to my favorite Republican think tank, which is American Compass, which is putting together a lot of arguments and policy proposals that I think if they were to be enacted would actually lead to a Republican Party that was, I mean, the Republican Party is never going to be left, but would be a much more moderate Republican Party on economic policy. So I will wrap things up there. Thank you very much. And we're going to move on to our panel. Okay, so we have, can you advance the slides? Just one. So we have a round of questions for the panelists.
No, wait, is this?
They should both be on.
Both are on, okay.
And I'm going to be quiet during this, mostly. And we have the questions behind us here. We'll do maybe 10 minutes for each, and everybody can speak as they like on whatever questions they have the most to say about. So we're going to begin with this first round here. So to the panelists, in your view, what are the most important factual disagreements regarding the economy and/or economic policy between Democrats and Republicans? And you're welcome to disagree with me. What are the repercussions? And are there any notable places where Democrats and Republicans actually agree? Where do we want to start? Why don't we start down here and then we can change it up.
All right, sure. Are you gonna hear me okay? So first of all, congratulations on the book. It is really great. I really enjoyed going through it. And I really think it's needed now. And I will answer the question, but I'm gonna preface this by praising the book and saying it's really needed now because, I mean, there is this sense, which may not even be inaccurate, but there is this sense that the Democratic Party has essentially abandoned working class issues, right? That is a very common view, that is the position. I don't know, I would take a nuanced view on that, but there is a reality there, and what beyond the reality, there's a perception that's there. And yet, what this book really shows is that the voters have not abandoned this, right? Democratic voters haven't stopped. And what's more, if anything, like the significance of this is increasing at the same time that it looks like the Democratic Party is moving away from this priority. So I think that leads to some rich set of questions, like, well, how is that working, and how is it that if the party that's associated with the idea of the democratic ideology of the American dream that you lay out in the book, if that's the party that has associated with that idea, why are they not picking up all of the voters who might want that, right? The people who are on that top end over there. What's happening with all of that? So to like important factual disagreements, I mean, there's a lot of them and we could go in a lot of different places, but since I get to go first, I get to take the low-hanging fruit, which is the impact and relationship of immigration to income and income inequality. I mean, there's a narrative about immigration that I think today is a little bit more about illegal immigrants are a threat and danger because seems even more scary and it's easier to mobilize. But underlying that is a threat, a notion that allowing more and broader immigration, hurts the labor opportunities of the working class, and that has that appeal. The evidence, economic evidence on that, again, I'm not the economist in the room either, but the economic evidence of that is not.
You must be the economist in the room.
Everything's going to jump. But I mean, the evidence is not that seems to be the right story, right? That there is a question. Certainly, though, the Democratic perception on the role of immigrants in the economy is much different, and much more of, not only are you bringing in laborers, but you're bringing in consumers, and it's driving the economy, and all the rest of that part of that goes in that direction, and that underpins a lot of the conflict. And the reason why it's so really important, and it connects back to the earlier praise I was pointing out, is that this, I think, is part of the explanation for why a number of people who might otherwise be inclined to say, well, I need economic policies that will work on addressing inequality, are voting for a party that does not appear to care as much about that question, because they think this way is a way in which they do care about it. That is the pitch. The way in which populism as a platform comes back to the economics is this particular promise that if we isolate ourselves both for immigration and in terms of trade and tariffs and so on and so forth, that'll redound to the less well off. And that's a difference in belief that matters a lot.
I'll be in the middle here. I come at this from a slightly different angle. I'm former journalist, morphed into an academic, and have been teaching politics and the media and the intersection of that for a long time. My feeling is the most important factual disagreements are who's important to the economy and what should the role of government be in setting economic policy. I kind of backed up, and to my mind, from that flows policy on immigration, the narrative on immigration, the split over what should be our policies, what should be our safety net, all of the issues that I think that we are confronting. And you sort of have to put Trump aside, I think. And I loved your book too, by the way. So that we can all agree on. I really enjoyed it because I think you flip it in a way that's, you flip what we're thinking, and I think that's always jarring. And then, wow, I got to think about it in that way. So I really love that.
Jane, can you say a little bit? You said who's important to the economy?
Who's important to the economy and what should be the role of government in setting economic policy. Mm-hmm. And from that, when you think about immigrants, to my mind, and I will put in a plug for the media because I think that we have learned about the impact of a lot of these policies, such as immigration, such as other policies through the media. I just was a judge in a political journalism contest that's named after Robin Toner, who was one of the first women to cover politics for the New York Times, and I was on the local level of judging, and there were so many wonderful pieces that were done by Texas publications, the Chicago Tribune, Alaska, going out and looking at the impact of Trump's policies. I wish, frankly, that we had more of a showcase for that, because to my mind, it depends a lot on how you portray the people who are impacted. And I would put in a plug for the media, maybe getting ahead of us, for pointing out that, oh, by the way, the people who are going to be impacted by these cuts that are coming through the big, beautiful bill are not necessarily how they've been portrayed. They are disabled. They are children. They are people that I think we're beginning to see the impact. And I think we are seeing that impact also on the policies of immigration. So I guess that's a bigger frame maybe, but to me that's where there is a disagreement as to who matters, really.
Okay. Well, so first off, I really appreciate this topic that you've taken on, Liz, and it's truly interdisciplinary, right? And so that's what makes it, I think, so important that we continue to look at this, just economic insecurity and inequality writ large. So, a couple of things that I want to point out. First off, this is homecoming for me because I was a professor in SPA for a decade. So I love coming back to AU. And, I think that what you've done here, and even in the first comments, thinking about immigration, it reminds me in part that this is a type of cross-cutting topic that has different political resonance even across some of the subgroups that you describe in the book. And, so labor and public finance economists, so I will yield to other panelists on a lot of the expertise on how this is playing out within communities and political opinions. But, I can certainly comfortably say that I think that this issue of immigration, international migration as a threat to domestic workers was certainly deployed effectively in many communities, including among some Black communities, right? And so and even teasing apart some aspects of progressive viewpoints, but then also some conservative views within these communities, right? There's a lot of heterogeneity within these groups, right? So that's just super interesting. Now, for me, I want to step back and talk a bit about some of the economic evidence on some of the big factors driving inequality in the U.S., and maybe talk about some of the things that I think there's broader agreement on, and maybe some of the areas where there's disagreement. So kind of three big stylized facts in co-authored work with Jim Ziliak and Elizabeth Krauss at Kentucky. We think we know that inequality and economic insecurity is driven by employment and the access to stable employment or lack thereof. So jobs and employment matter. Certainly there are large earnings gaps that emerge across education. So education attainment matters. And you can look at this over a 5-decade period and see the evidence. And then we also know statistically that marriage does seem to be important. And so on this third point, and Liz popped this up on the deck pretty early on, I want to take a little bit of time here, because in our work, there's a second component to the statistical importance of how households are faring if they're married versus unmarried households, which is that, yes, statistically, this is one of the important factors. But I think there's broad disagreement on how folks come to arrive at this situation, whether and to what degree this is fully a choice, whether and to what degree there are other deeper structural factors shaping arrival at marriage. And so, yes, mechanically, 2 incomes greater than 1, we all get that in the room. But actually, over the past 3 to 4 decades, there's been a fascinating demographic trend emerging, which is that in the 1970s, if you were to look at a top-earning male or a top-earning female, on average, that earner was likely to be partnered up with someone roughly in the middle of the income distribution, 1970s. And so, in effect, who folks found themselves to be in relationships with was kind of noisy on the dimension of income. But by 2016 to 2018 in our data, what we essentially find is that no, high earner men are partnering up with high earner women, and college educateds are partnering up with one another. That's very much interrelated. And it's a very sharp linear relationship here, right? So, this data complicates the narrative of if we just turn on a marriage button, then we can solve this inequality problem, okay? And that's not to say that this doesn't have a role to play. In terms of complicating this a bit more, marriage promotion efforts were deployed throughout the Bush administration, Bush 2, and with, I would say, mixed to weak results. And so one has to think hard about, if you have scarce dollars, where are you going to deploy those scarce dollars in terms of having the biggest benefit? So I think marriage is maybe one area where there's broad disagreement, at least in the policy community, in terms of the relative importance, in terms of comparing that versus sort of education access, different structural economic factors, and bluntly, intergenerational economic mobility evidence that there's a persistence in where children are landing as adults. And this gets to your notion of, essentially the American dream. It shouldn't really matter where you started if you work hard. This kind of compendium of statistical evidence, starting with Gary Salon, more recently the Raj Chetty team, just deploying a lot of this data that says the same thing, which is that, neighborhoods and the economic conditions of parents loom large as huge statistical predictors. Doesn't mean that some kids don't overcome that, but that data is pretty overwhelming.
So I want to ask, do you all see places where there is agreement between the parties, or is that almost non-existent these days? Is there some important area of?
I think you have to almost differentiate between the people and the parties.
Okay.
You know, I mean, you've studied these platforms, which I think is a terrific idea. Maybe I should say. I mean, I was thinking. I mean, there are areas that people. I mean, I know that sounds crazy, but there are areas that Americans say they want. Everybody seems to want clean air. Everybody seems to agree. I guess the two parties agree on infrastructure, although it doesn't seem to be happening. And I think the idea of, I wrote down some things, clean air, infrastructure. People don't want lead pipes poisoning their children. I mean, there's certain things that are definitely bipartisan that I think, but I don't know, you studied the political platforms. You know, I think, I'm not expressing this as well as I'd like. I think there are areas that people care about. Mm-hmm. But they don't end up for various reasons that have to do with our political structure and who gets elected and who gets primaried, right?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I won't argue with the idea that the parties are awfully polarized over this. I mean, this is what I've seen in recent years. One thing that comes to mind is there does seem to be a consensus forming around the notion of affordability being important. Yeah. So thoughts on that? Is that real?
If Donald Trump is embracing it, it's of interest to the Republican Party. It's something that he's perceived. Maybe he you know, that this is something, and people also people the post game quarterbacking on Kamala Harris is she didn't talk about it enough.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I think. I mean, one thing I would say to is the affordability as an example, and many of the other examples of things that the parties agree on. They're almost all outcome descriptions, right? Everyone would like to see prices be affordable. The difference is that the policies that Democrats think you would do to get to that, and the policies that Republicans think you would do to get to that, are really different. A lot of the things that the parties disagree on aren't even on common goals, right? They would actually have a different vision for what the country should look like. But where they converge, even there, I think the policy instruments are pretty different.
So before we get to a policy discussion, I did want to talk a little bit about underlying causes of these differences. I mean, to some degree with hope that we might be able to bridge some of these differences, because this is a moment in time where I think the differences are pretty stark. I mean, so Jane, your role in studying the media, I know you think media has something to do with this. So what do you think about what may be underlying some of these differences?
The perceptions?
Factual beliefs between
Pardon?
Factual beliefs, perceptions about the economy.
Well, I think, you know, it's just, I don't even know if Rubik's Cube is the right metaphor here. I mean, to my mind, I think a lot has to do with the depiction of, how shall I say this? I think that let me see if I can. I'm drawing a blank here. You want to ask me that again, would you? Tell me again.
Yeah.
Seriously.
So if we could identify the causes of these different perspectives on the economy, right and left, right, Republican, Democrat.
I think it gets to your
causes?
I think it gets to what you started with the idea that are we a meritocracy, and what you were saying. And I think that over time, many people have become, particularly on the Democratic side, more skeptical of the idea that if you work hard, things will come to you. I teach young people. The latest Harvard Institute of Politics poll shows inflation at the top. Economic insecurity. That's part of why a lot of people went over to Donald Trump, I believe, in the last election. And the sense that I asked my students about American exceptionalism, and the polling on that is is, that there's far less of a belief in that than there used to be. So I think it's the reality people are experiencing, and I also think it is disappointment over this ideal.
Hans, if you don't mind, I'm going to put you on the spot. So you've written a lot about ideology, including the formation of ideology. Do you have thoughts on this from your work?
Yeah. So I think the model and the way that you play it out in the book is, I think, exactly the right way to think about it, which is that political actors, whether they be politicians who are interested in winning election or a couple steps back, but people who are just like trying to convince you that their prescriptions are the right ones or whatever else, will marshal evidence in favor of that, and that evidence is not always the whole picture, right? And it's not unique to the left or the right, although I think you correctly noted in the slides that the ground truth is not like somewhere in smack in the middle here. But that's just the way we learn pretty much everything. And if you remove that from politics for a second, it's not weird, right? Like, how do you know anything that you know? You know it because you talk to people who you think know better and who you think you're aligned with their values in the right way, so you don't think they're going to mislead you. And then they tell you these things and you trust them, right? And some of those things you go and learn a little bit more about so you can learn it yourself. But most things you have to trust someone. So it's not surprising then that when it comes to politics and you've got two or more clusters of views. So this is the way I would think about what is ideology is. It's a collection of beliefs and prescriptions and policies and just groups that you like and everything else, but a whole mess of that. And then that transmits to from whoever's constructing it. I really sort of emphasize and think a lot about intellectuals, and especially sort of public intellectual types that go from very intellectual all the way down to the folks that we might not recognize as intellectual, but nevertheless are still loud voices, that they're doing some of this sort of creative synthesis, which is what Phil Converse called this process. And then that disseminates. But I mean, parties, you don't need that, right? Parties could just be doing this because they're trying to put together platforms and coalitions, and so they're trying to bundle things in this way. And so, yeah, I think that's what is happening, and I think that is what explains the difference, as you, I think, well demonstrate with the empirical evidence in the book.
So, I mean, our system hasn't always been this polarized, right? So is there a path that you foresee to kind of bridging these divides, whether kind of artificial, whether, maybe there's some inertia because, we know that the parties actually are becoming more similar economically in terms of, the coalitions themselves. Thoughts about, 5-10 years from now?
Ooh, you go.
Yeah. So again, with true deference to experts who are thinking about media and politics, and acknowledging that part of what makes the inequality and economic insecurity work enriching is when you can add this perspective. I think that maybe a pessimistic view is that as a student of U.S. social policy, you had to learn a little bit about the politics of deservingness. So that means that I'm really a labor economist, but I had to learn a little bit about this politics of how you frame a particular economic family unit, why they come to be in the situation they're in. And, this has a very kind of unapologetic, blunt racial component to it. Throughout the history of the U.S., and even going back into co-authored work with my good friend Trevon Logan, economic historian, thinking about some of these vignettes and themes going back to post-Reconstruction, and whether and to what degree we were willing to invest in public goods. So, okay, that's a winding kind of tour de force. Coming back to today, some of those same themes of deservingness are being deployed on a lot of the international migrant communities, right? And so they're very familiar themes. And yet, as you all point out, there is a shared economic anxiety, housing, healthcare, childcare, utilities. These are all putting pressure on household budgets across race and ethnicity. So, I mean, I will throw it back, but certainly the economic data suggests that those are pressures being felt pretty broadly across the economic spectrum and well above the poverty line, right? So that's absolutely an opportunity. I think I just read recently that there is I guess, a coalition between Josh Hawley and Elizabeth Warren to take on essentially big pharmaceutical companies. Essentially, this is found to be somewhat anti-competitive. And, I thought to myself, wow, as a consumer of political data, not a producer, it seems like there might be some tension around housing policy interventions. I hope we can talk about that. But that it could be, and I'm posing this, that people have decided they don't like U.S. healthcare. They don't like big pharma. That's been made to be kind of a metaphorical thing that everybody can decide they dislike. I'm not saying that that's the way it should be, but if so, then that's kind of interesting. Yeah.
A really obvious thing that you all know is that our system rewards lack of cooperation, and we have gerrymandering, and we have residential sorting, and we have all kinds of things where people, I don't want to get too personal here. I have a lot of relatives who are in Texas who are used to describe themselves as moderate Republicans. It sounds it sounds Pollyanna-ish in a way, but there is some research where if you bring people together and you don't let them know what their political parties are, and y'all are all working on something together, that has proven to be some way. You're familiar with that you don't know the party, therefore you don't label the person immediately, and you come together to work on something. I see that as a possibility. I also understand that local government and people's local officials. We have the problem of news deserts, which impact also on coverage of politics and coverage of government. But locally, people can work together, I think, because they start out feeling as if they know each other. It seems so basic, but we've sort of gotten away from that, I think.
So maybe a combination of real pressures that people are experiencing, unfortunately, and efforts. I know there are a lot of nonprofits that are involved in trying to bring people together.
People are trying to bring people together.
Yeah. Any other?
Well, so I guess I want to, be the more sinister voice in this direction, because there's a strong desire, I think, to talk about the way to solve these kinds of places where there's major disagreement is, to find some common ground and get people to work across the lines, and that is. It would be better if more of that happened. So that is, I guess, a good thing. But there's also there's a factual difference between the two perspectives, and it is not obvious to me that there's some convex combination between the two of them that is the best place, right? So, the theory, as I take it from reading the book, and which I think is correct, that of the sort of Republican ideology of how this works is that I teach statistics, so I'm always going to think in terms of a statistical framework here. But say your dependent variable is wealth and economic success, right? And the independent variable for Republicans is hard work and virtue and doing the right thing and effort and maybe talents and skills or whatever. It's mostly that stuff. There may be a few other things, marriage and a few other things, but it's like that. Are you good? Do you do it right, and you win? The Democratic theory is not that's gone. The Democratic theory is, okay, maybe there is a relationship there, but the variance around that relationship is big. And so there's just a lot of randomness that happens. There are other things that matter. And so just because someone's not successful doesn't mean they didn't work hard, and maybe doesn't mean they didn't deserve to be, we can be concerned about them. That's the whole notion of a safety net, is that sometimes the line isn't tight. And that there are other variables that matter a ton, right? That there are racial and gender and educational opportunities, and some people, get ahead by being, selfish and cruel, and those other variables also matter. And so it's a richer story, but which subsumes the Republican model, I think. I suppose there are some Democrats who are say, there's no hard work at all, and Elon Musk is just an idiot. But I don't think that's true. think he's not as smart as he thinks he is, but I don't think that he's an idiot. And I do think he put a lot of effort into succeeding, and then he did succeed. But where he ended up is vastly more than other people who worked just as hard and who have just as much skill, and then they didn't. And so that's the inequality that the Democrats think you need to do something about. That story is more real than the other story. So if we're looking to try to find some sort of like common ground, yeah, we do need to find common ground, but there's another way to do that, which is that one party could have the right story, convince people that they have the right story. The other party would then would start losing and would have to change it on everything and just like abandon that as the thing to differ with, and they would get defeated. And I think given that parties are about that clash, that's maybe a more optimistic, ultimately, pathway to getting past this than, convincing everyone to get along and then, I have this little bit that's not as bad. And then meanwhile, big policy changes that are not targeting just, pharmaceutical industry should be, they're villains, sure, but there are a lot of other villains too that Josh Hawley isn't interested in going after, right? And so, I feel like there is a, in other words, party differences are real because they actually do want different things. And if what we're saying is that what one of the parties wants is more desirable, which, I'm academic, so I'm going to stop from saying quite that. But if that is what we're saying, then we want that party to win.
Yeah, and we have,
But
we have a couple marketplace of ideas, right?
You pointed out the split between the populism and the donor class. That to me is like, how does that get solved? Because there are, I again, as a media person, I think the media felt they missed Trump in 2016, and then everybody went to Pennsylvania and started reporting on people, and then, oh, by the way, it turned out that a lot of people with incomes over $50,000 voted for Donald Trump, and so we went this way. We felt we missed that narrative, then we went this way, and to me, you said there's the wealthy donor class, and then there's this vision Donald Trump very effectively put forward. Yeah. Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, to me, in some ways, in 2016, there is that strain of this is unfair. The idea that Trump managed to portray himself in this way, given what his background was, is really remarkable. It is quite an achievement politically.
He did come up through the media, so he's
well,
pretty good
yes,
at it.
And he loved. Boy, talk about a love-hate relationship.
So I want to pivot to talking a little bit about policy before we open it up for questions, and I want to make sure that we talk a little bit about policies that we think would be helpful for making the American dream more accessible to more people, and then if people have ideas about something that could reach across party lines, and to Hans's point, there are other ways of coming together besides kind of a kumbaya moment of we all have the same perspective, which is parties can get to the same policy because it accomplishes different things for them, right? So there are different ways in which we could get to that bipartisan consensus. So let's talk policy, and Bradley, I know that you wanted to talk some policy.
Sure, yeah. I really appreciate this conversation that, ultimately where there is kind of well-defined data from the economic side is around the degree and extent to which many U.S. households are cost burdened on their housing expenses. And so that's whether you're a renter, whether you're an owner, and this is cross-cutting. And so, we could talk about healthcare and unanticipated medical events as being a major cause of bankruptcy, childcare through the roof in many jurisdictions. But if we just focus on housing, my view is that this is going to be an area that has great potential for bold and expansive reform. Now, what's interesting here is that I've not spent the bulk of my career thinking about housing policy reforms, but I do care about economic insecurity. And so once you care about that latter point, you've got to be more attentive to some of these policy interventions that hit along the domain of housing. Much of my work has been more around income support policies and things like this. But, ultimately, where I find this to be interesting, and maybe this is even a question for the panel, is that it's possible that many of the most effective housing policy interventions, perhaps inadvertently, lead to a result where the net worth of many Americans might be diminished because they hold it in their home. And so there's an interesting tension there. But nevertheless, for many American families, they're going to put their kids through college, they're going to play by the rules, and their son or daughter might even come out and have a job making $100,000 a year. And kind of subjectively, this feels like this should be, quote unquote, enough. But I think what's interesting about housing is that there's a real psychological component. It's a proxy indicator for having been successful. And so do you change the definition of success and say, like, look, success might not be a house with a driveway. Maybe it's one bedroom apartment. Do you move the needle that way? But I think this is going to resonate. And so, here I lean on folks like Makeda Henry-Nicky at the J.P. Morgan Chase Institute, Jenny Schutz, who was at Brookings for many years, now at Arnold Ventures. And, I think broadly speaking, without getting into, a lot of the details, you could think about this as three-pronged. You could think about, essentially land taxes. You could think about essentially zoning reforms. And then you could think about more direct transfers, housing subsidies. So kind of three-pronged, and that's really borrowing from some of the work that Jenny's done over the years. Three-pronged, much more ambitious, much more aggressive than we currently are. So I think that's certainly an area where, just based on my reading of the data and my instincts, that this is a real pressure that cuts across ideological lines. So, yeah.
I think the area of parents and family and childcare and caretakers. A lot of people are in, what came to be termed the sandwich generation a few years ago, and a lot of people are nodding their heads. I think that has become an issue that has come to the fore of people needing support for childcare, the cost of childcare. I think the New York mayoral race is very interesting in that way, and also. Just in general, I think that's something that many people could agree on, that it is better for families not to be bankrupting themselves, or for people not to have access to affordable childcare. That, to me, how we do it, I wouldn't say, but I think that is an issue that a lot of people, it just doesn't make sense for people. It doesn't make sense for people to not be able to work, for someone not to be able to get, to be basically in their home, unable to do anything else, or unable to work, or unable to get childcare. The distance people are traveling to get to jobs and all of that. I think just that whole area of family and caretaking and just looking at it and saying this doesn't make sense, it might be an area for people to come together on.
Yeah, so I don't have a lot of great policy prescriptions because I'm always like, how do we get the people into office in the first place? That's my main focus. But so part of what you're asking though, so earlier I said, that when the parties agree, that's usually on ends and not on means. And this is like, but okay, are there any means that they could agree on, even if perhaps they serve different ends? That's essentially what you're asking, which I think is the right question to ask. And also there are things that are in there. And what's useful about that is that you can then build a creative coalition at the legislative stage, regardless of whatever happens in the elections, that puts that together. And housing seems like a really great example of that. You think about developers, of course, they benefit from having fewer restrictions on where they're allowed to build, how much they're allowed to build, and then one of the consequences of that is that you have maybe more housing, right? So that kind of story of the sort of let's build more homes in heavily zoned urban areas kind of thing. And I think that makes a lot of sense. In the policy making place, the way that that plays out is still that the parties come, in elected wanting both of those things. And if you don't have anyone in the legislature that cares about serving this general interest and that represents those groups that we've identified there, then they're not going to do this. And then they have to be willing to work with each other to create this. And the problem we have in the legislature right now is that there's a lot of incentive for politicians to not produce anything because they don't want there to be, no one wants the other side to have a win. And so I do think we need to do some kind of work at not mitigating polarization, not in the people disagree thing, because they're going to disagree, but in the sense of the other side is a monster and we can't cooperate with them. That is not easy. But I will say that most of the research that is on that question tends to focus on voters who feel this way, which is easy and good and important. But the problem is leaders who are unwilling to work with other folks. That is, there are people who are interested in that question, and I've starting to. But I think that's where the place is. It's where leaders can lead and not just play into and even fuel that kind of affective polarization.
Thank you. Did you want to add something?
How much time do we have? Because I know there's a bunch
So,
of folks here
yeah,
who want to jump in.
Like
right?
maybe one last
So-
comment and then we'll go to a question. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I guess one thing that I would tee up is that, in my estimation, there is this disconnect between how economic policy and political policy thinkers sort of communicate and what maybe voters and households want. And I'm just taken very briefly back to sort of 2023, 2024. And, I recall the Harris campaign talking about prices. And at one point, I found myself in discussion about price controls. So I teach microeconomics, and we teach commonly that price controls lead to all sorts of distortions and things like this. And yet, the work of folks like Alan Blinder, who worked in the Clinton administration, speaks to the notion that you do have to give the candidate some set of policy tools to go out and work with, to kind of tell folks that you have some ideas about how you could solve a problem. And, what I watched was, just in my view, the Harris team get beat down pretty hard for suggesting price controls, but from within the party. And so I was thinking to myself, like, we do this for certain agricultural products, milk. Right now, if the stock market has price volatility and irregularity, we just flip it off. It was a mistake. Let's just turn it off and let's just suspend trading. So it's not to say that I'm not concerned about price controls, but we do this in other domains. And, this is maybe more for the policy actors who are selling the ideas that folks are looking for some bold ideas, and maybe even the academics aren't the right ones to always be selling it, because I'm going to tell you about all the reasons it could go wrong. But folks are looking for robust solutions.
Yeah. Yeah.
One more thing I want to say, language, framing, price controls.
Yeah.
How does that sound?
Yeah.
How about, naming of things matters. Again, Trump understands that brilliantly, putting his name on the Kennedy Center. What we name things, what we call things communicates. Price controls does not sound like a great thing.
All right. So we need to workshop this for the next Harris campaign, right? Because that's coming. All right. So we're going to open things up to questions, please. And I do think that there are some microphones out there that people can use. We've got about 10 minutes or so.
Can start with Dr. Barker? Go ahead, David. Yeah, but you can be loud enough. Got it.
So I really appreciate all of this, and you guys are all great and lived up to my very high expectations. But one of the things that I was curious to see your thoughts on is, this is about debating the American dream and about sort of the perspectives of Republicans and Democrats and the sort of premises that they rely on to believe these things. And one of the reasons, of course, which I think you mentioned, Liz, at the beginning, that Democrats and Republicans tend to have these different understandings has to do with whom they represent, right? But as you also noted, that's changed. There's been a massive class inversion that has taken place over the course of the past 20 years, such that the white working class is overwhelmingly Republican now. But the part that you didn't talk as much about is that the Democratic Party is overwhelmingly extremely highly educated and pretty wealthy. And so, people always talk about Republicans supposedly voting against their self-interest by voting against social safety nets and stuff. But Democrats routinely vote to raise their own taxes. And so, it seems to me that historically, I don't know how many times there's ever been a party system, or how long it's gone on. How long
I think you're not on. Yeah.
whatever, how long it's gone on, where there's a mismatch between the constituency of a party and its policy platform. And it makes me wonder just how much longer the Democratic Party will, in fact, continue to push policy, egalitarian policies, or if inevitably, in 20, 30 years, if we're going to be looking at a Democratic Party and leaders of the Democratic Party that sound all like Mitt Romney.
Yeah, I mean, I would say I personally think that this can't go on that much longer. And so either the parties become more similar in terms of the way they depict the economy, or the Democrats win back more lower earning people and more affluent people shuffle back over to the Republican Party. I do think that it's likely we're at this moment in time where we can't be at a stable equilibrium, basically. But that said, I do want to point out that economic inequality has gotten so severe that people who are college educated actually can be completely pissed off about it, right? Because they're looking up at, they're at the 90th percentile, and they're looking at everybody above, and they're looking at, our billionaires, et cetera, and feeling kind of aggrieved. So I think that there is space, given stark, inequality in the U.S., for plenty of Democrats to feel unhappy about it.
Well, we really didn't talk about the Democratic Party and how they lost white working class voters and how that we haven't even talked about that.
I want to I throw a little wrinkle into this the class inversion narrative a little bit, right? So yes, there's a class inversion if you define class as college educated. That's a huge change. Economically, as you show, it's not a realignment, it's a de-alignment, right? And that matters because if we want to say is there going to be this sudden flip where suddenly the Democratic Party takes on a different position, it has to be that they really start thinking that is the only constituency that they can have, and they are kind of still trying to hold on to the other part of the constituency. In fact, most Democratic leaders are really concerned about this loss of working class voters, and it's white working class voters, and it's especially white, rural, non-college educated when you define it in those ways. Then it starts becoming more clear that that's the right group. Other demographics is not so much of an inversion. So I think the first that we need to put that into the dynamic. The other thing to note is that you're right. The well-to-do Democrats do vote against their interest, and they know that they're doing it, and they care a lot about it. I actually had this exact conversation in my undergrad seminar yesterday, where we were talking about how the Democratic Party is not connected to the to its voters and how to make this happen and everything else, and then. The sense in the room was overwhelmingly that the people in the room who are, going to an elite university and are more or less affluent and were all Democrats, were upset that the Democratic Party was embracing the idea that capitalism could be compatible with democracy, right? These were well, no, wait, I'm not a Marxist, but, right? That's the conversation we were having with these educated people. So, yes, education is inverting, but it is not bringing with it people who are really invested in, getting, not caring about this. Now, that doesn't mean, they can say it and then they'll still vote for a Mitt Romney Democrat because the thing they really care about is some other social issues or something else. But I don't see the support for this ideology that Liz outlines in the book eroding among young Democrats.
Thank you. Great. So other questions?
Can you just speak loudly? The hand mics are breaking up.
Yeah, this is really, really interesting. I have several questions about the public opinion data. I'm a public opinion researcher. Of course, I'm going to have questions about the data, and then a larger, perhaps a little bit more depressing question that I would love to hear everybody's thoughts about. So, on the data questions, Liz, you were talking a lot about there's a lot of heterogeneity about independence. I was wondering how you were defining independence. Are leaners with the party? Are they not with the party? Because a lot of that heterogeneity in public opinion research we tend to see based on how you define independence. Are there any age effects in this? Because we've done some research over at YouGov, and I was looking at some of the data from 2024 earlier, and what I saw there is like older folks tend to believe in the American dream a lot more than younger people. And we're in a university, so I would love to hear a little bit about that if you took a look at that in the book, and if not, it could be like an interesting, that's research. And then kind of like the larger, perhaps more depressing question. I kind of really like what Jane said about differentiating between people and parties, right? Because like a lot of times when we think about public opinion data, we are kind of predicating on the idea that leaders are going to pay attention to the data. And what we have seen perhaps over the past year or so in big polarized issues, like particularly immigration, is like that responsiveness is not really coming through from some of the leaders. So my really depressing question is like, assuming that the American dream is dead and everybody eventually agrees, the affordability issues completely kill the idea that the American dream exists. How do we even move past this as a country if we can have a party saying like, well, I think everybody thinks that affordability matters, but the reason that things are not affordable is because of those guys over there trying to make my life impossible. And does that lead to any kind of like authoritarian consolidation?
Okay, I'm going to do mine quickly and then I'll pass to you. So independents that I showed you are pure independents, so they're not leaners, so a lot of heterogeneity among them. And there is an age effect, although maybe smaller than you might think, where yes, young people are more pessimistic about the American dream. And so,
Are you turning to me?
So Emil had asked about the people in parties and. Well,
no, I appreciate your saying that. Again, I was just looking up the Harvard poll, which is not the only poll, but there are a couple of. I brought. The other thing that we didn't say is people have agreed that the economy is in bad shape while we're doing well, which is a whole other thing. I mean, the perception of that. But let me just this 3 in 10 U.S. adults rate economic conditions as this country is excellent or good, while roughly 7 in 10 rate them as only fair or poor. This is Pew. The Harvard, let me see if I wrote down, the Harvard thing listed, I believe they listed inflation. Young people were listing inflation as the top issue, economic insecurity. The thing that, maybe I'm getting off point here, but I get concerned as a professor in my class at what, I hope none of my students are here, but is a kind of, what you said, maybe not an openness, to, maybe I'm putting words in your mouth, but maybe it's more what Hans said, that I think there's a lot of alienation. We haven't even talked about campaign finance, which I think is also highly corrosive.
Oh, we could go all night talking about.
We could go all night, but I think among young people. Okay, no, I mean the feeling that this is owned by. I mean, that's why Vivek, when he talked about you're owned. I mean, that is an appealing argument that this whole system is owned by people and they don't represent you. But with my students, just speaking, they are concerned about their future, and they're also looking at data that show that having a college education may not be that helpful. That's hardly encouraging.
And AI may be coming for
and
their
AI,
job.
there's also a huge concern about AI.
Let's do one more question. We are just about out of time. I don't know. Want to go back here? The young lady with her.
So we've seen some successes from alternate parties like Mayor Mamdani in New York on the basis of affordability. How viable do you think third parties are right now? And do you think it's better to create third parties or focus on improving the parties that we already have?
Political scientists will tell you that a third-party candidate will never win for the presidency. But if we're talking about local elections, clearly that can be different. But certainly third parties can be useful right now for local elections, for pressuring larger parties. What do people have to say about third parties?
Hans answer that.
So Mamdani won as Democrat.
Yeah, fair
right?
point, yeah.
So yes, he ran in the primary and changed what the Democratic Party in New York stood for, but he changed what the Democratic Party in New York stood for. That's what we have a million reasons why we have a dominant two-party system. One of them is primaries. Right, the fact that the pressure that you would have in a different system, Mamdani would run as a third party or fourth party candidate, and because they wouldn't have an opportunity to change what the Democratic Party stood for. So I don't think parties are important. I think the number of parties and the structure of parties also has real consequences. But I think in the sort of medium term, the most plausible path is through changing what the parties stand for and what they prioritize. And really, yeah, more even prioritize than stand for. Like, it's not like the Democratic Party never cared about the things. It just didn't put them at the front of its agenda in New York. And a Democratic Party that's run by Bloomberg is a very different Democratic Party, but it's still a Democratic Party. Changing those priorities is the way in which our system is open to internal party conflict, and so I think that's like where the avenue is in the primary process. I would love to see a different set of institutions and a different party system, but we're not going to see that in the near future.
So we're going to wrap things up there. Thank you all so much for coming. I can't speak for the others, but I'm happy to hang around and talk with anybody if you have further questions. So thanks so much.